Miss Marple and the Mystery of Dr. Haydock's House Call, narrated by Edward from Warm Pages. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Before we begin, I have a little question for you. Can you remember when you first heard of Miss Marple? Was it a quiet evening with a mystery novel, a Sunday TV marathon, or perhaps a recommendation from someone dear? Share your story in the comments. I always love reading how Miss Marple became part of your life. Now get comfortable with your tea or coffee, and let's begin. Chapter 1. A Feverish Telephone at Dusk. The November storm had come upon St. Mary Mead with the suddenness of an unwelcome visitor, rattling windows and sending leaves spiralling through the grey afternoon air like autumn's final desperate dance. Miss Jane Marple, carefully picking her way along the high street with her shopping basket tucked securely under one arm, observed with mild disapproval how the wind seemed determined to make a thorough nuisance of itself. The wireless had promised only light showers, but Miss Marple had lived through enough English Novembers to know that weather, like human nature, rarely behaved precisely as one expected. She paused outside the post office to adjust her hat, noting with interest that Mrs. Weatherby's cat had taken refuge beneath the baker's awning and was regarding the world with the same resigned expression she had observed on many a parishioner's face during the vicar's longer sermons. It was this brief halt that allowed her to witness the first telephone line snap with a sharp crack, sending sparks dancing briefly in the growing dusk before the wire fell lifeless across the pavement. Then another line gave way, and another, until it seemed the storm was methodically severing St. Mary Mead's connections to the outside world with the efficiency of a particularly determined surgeon. Miss Marple quickened her pace, her mind already turning to practical matters. Dr. Haydock's surgery was only 2 streets away, and she had promised to deliver the sock she had finished darning for him the previous evening. The dear man was rather careless with his clothing, and his housekeeper, though devoted, had a tendency to regard darning as somehow beneath her dignity. The surgery stood on a slight rise, its solid Victorian brick facade offering a reassuring permanence against the storm's theatrical display. As Miss Marple approached the front door, she could see warm light glowing from the windows of both the waiting room and Dr. Haydock's private consulting room beyond. It was a comforting sight in the gathering darkness. She was reaching for the brass knocker when the telephone's shrill ring cut through the wind's howling. Even through the heavy oak door she could hear it clearly, insistent and somehow urgent in a way that made her pause with her hand still raised. The ringing stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of Dr. Haydock's voice, though his words were indistinct. Miss Marple found herself hesitating, caught between the proper impulse to announce her arrival and an equally proper reluctance to interrupt what might be an important medical consultation. The decision was made for her when the door swung open, revealing Dr. Haydock himself, his usually ruddy face pale with concern and his grey hair dishevelled as though he had been running his fingers through it. "Miss Marple?" he exclaimed, then seemed to collect himself slightly. "Forgive me, I didn't expect. That is, please come in out of this dreadful weather." She stepped into the familiar warmth of the surgery's entrance hall, noting immediately the tension in the doctor's manner. In all her years of acquaintance with Dr. Haydock, she had rarely seen him so obviously disturbed. "I hope I'm not intruding, Doctor," she said gently, producing the carefully wrapped sock from her basket. "I merely wish to return this to you, properly mended." Dr. Haydock took the package with a distracted air, his attention clearly elsewhere. "Most kind of you, Miss Marple. Most kind indeed. Though, I'm afraid—" He paused, glancing toward his consulting room where the telephone sat silent on his desk. "Is something troubling ye?" Miss Marple inquired, settling herself uninvited into one of the waiting room chairs, with the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime recognizing when others needed to unburden themselves. The doctor hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. "It was Nurse Pell," he said, moving to the window and peering out into the storm, calling from Overcombe Grange about Mrs. Arkwright. "The poor woman's having another of her attacks, a severe one by all accounts." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She knew Mrs. Lydia Arkwright by reputation rather than personal acquaintance, the widow being something of a recluse since her husband's death 3 years previous. The asthma that plagued her was common knowledge in the village, as was her considerable fortune and her distinctly uncomfortable relationship with her nephew Edward. Nurse Pell sounded quite beside herself, Dr. Haydock continued, turning from the window, begging me to come at once, saying she feared for Mrs. Arkwright's life. The curious thing is— He paused, frowning. "Yes?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Well, it's probably nothing, but Nurse Pell mentioned that she'd tried to reach me earlier, several times in fact, but couldn't get through. Yet my telephone has been working perfectly all day. It's only the village lines that have been affected by the storm." Miss Marple considered this information with the careful attention she habitually applied to any deviation from the expected pattern of events. "How very odd," she murmured, "and Mrs. Arkwright's condition is truly serious." So it would seem. Nurse Pell was quite emphatic about the urgency. Dr. Haydock moved toward his medical bag, which sat ready on his desk. "I must go at once, of course. Overcombe Grange is a good 2 miles beyond the village, and in this weather—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Miss Marple understood his concern. The road to Overcombe Grange was narrow and winding even in good conditions, and the isolated house sat well back from the main thoroughfare, approached only by a private drive that wound through a grove of ancient yew trees. "Perhaps," she suggested carefully, "you might appreciate some company on such a journey. I'm sure Mrs. Bantry would be happy to provide transportation, and another pair of hands might prove useful." Dr. Haydock looked surprised, then grateful. "That's very thoughtful of you, Miss Marple, though I shouldn't wish to involve you in what might prove to be a rather distressing situation." "My dear doctor," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile, "at my age one becomes quite accustomed to distressing situations. Indeed, I find they often prove far less alarming than they initially appear." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of a motor car could be heard approaching through the storm, its engine note steady despite the wind. Dr. Haydock peered through the window again. "That will be Godfrey Miles," he said with evident relief. "My dispensing chemist. Excellent fellow, always reliable in an emergency. He must have heard about Mrs. Arkwright's condition somehow." Miss Marple observed with interest as a tall, thin figure emerged from the motor car, hunched against the wind and rain. Mr. Miles moved with the careful precision she associated with his profession, his movements economical and purposeful, as he retrieved what appeared to be several metal cylinders from the vehicle's rear compartment. "Oxygen cylinders," Dr. Haydock explained, already reaching for his coat, most thoughtful of him to anticipate the need. As Mr. Miles approached the surgery door, Miss Marple found herself studying his face through the window. There was something in his expression, a tightness around the eyes that suggested more than mere professional concern. But then, she reflected, emergency calls in such weather would naturally cause anxiety in any one of a conscientious disposition. The wind gave a particularly violent gust, rattling the surgery windows and causing the lights to flicker momentarily. In that brief dimming, Miss Marple thought she caught sight of another figure moving between the houses across the street, but when the light steadied, there was nothing to be seen but the storm-lashed darkness. "Well then," said Dr. Haydock, settling his medical bag securely under his arm, "we must be off. Mrs. Arkwright cannot wait for the weather to improve." Miss Marple rose from her chair, her mind already turning over the curious elements of the evening's events. Something about the situation at Overcombe Grange troubled her, though she could not yet put her finger on precisely what it might be. Perhaps it was simply the storm, with its unsettling effect on the ordinary rhythms of village life. Or perhaps it was something more subtle, a discordant note in the symphony of coincidences that had brought them all together on this particular evening. Whatever the case, Miss Marple reflected as she prepared to venture into the tempestuous night, experience had taught her that when the normal patterns of life were disrupted, it was wise to pay very careful attention indeed to what might emerge from the chaos. Chapter 2. Lights burning at Overcombe Grange. Dr. Haydock's motor car disappeared into the storm-swept darkness, with a finality that left Miss Marple standing in the surgery doorway. watching the red tail lights fade like dying embers. The wind caught her coat and tugged at it with insistent fingers, but she remained motionless for a moment longer, her mind turning over the curious circumstances of the evening. It was then that she heard the familiar puttering of Mrs. Bantry's ancient Morris, approaching through the gloom with the determined persistence of a reliable friend. The vehicle drew up beside the surgery with a gentle wheeze of brakes, and Dolly Bantry's cheerful face appeared at the driver's window. "Jane, my dear," she called above the wind, "whatever are you doing standing about in this frightful weather? You'll catch your death." Miss Marple hurried toward the car, grateful for both the shelter and the company. As she settled into the passenger seat, she noticed that Mrs. Bantry was already dressed for an expedition, complete with waterproof coat and sensible boots. "I heard about poor Mrs. Arkwright," Dolly explained, engaging the gears with practised efficiency. "Mrs. Pierce from the post office telephoned just before the lines went down completely. Dreadful business, having an attack in weather like this." "Dr. Haydock seemed quite concerned," Miss Marple observed, arranging her skirts as the Morris began its cautious journey through the village. "Though I confess I found myself wondering—" "Yes," Mrs. Bantry encouraged, navigating carefully around a fallen branch that blocked half the road. "Well, it struck me as rather odd that Mr. Miles should arrive so promptly with oxygen cylinders, almost as though he had been expecting the emergency." Mrs. Bantry considered this as they passed the last of the village houses and began the winding ascent toward Overcombe Grange. "Godfrey Miles has always been most conscientious about his duties. Perhaps he simply keeps a close eye on his more vulnerable patients." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, though something in her tone suggested she remained unconvinced. The road to Overcombe Grange had always possessed a somewhat forbidding character, even in daylight and fair weather. Tonight, with the storm transforming familiar landmarks into threatening shadows, it seemed positively ominous. Ancient hedgerows pressed close on either side, their branches reaching across the narrow carriageway like gnarled fingers, while overhead the wind sent clouds racing across the face of a nearly full moon. "I do hope we're not being foolish," Mrs. Bantry remarked, peering through the windscreen as the wipers struggled against the driving rain. "Perhaps we should have simply waited for news at home." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and leaned forward slightly. "I think not, my dear. In my experience, waiting at home rarely provides the complete picture of events." They had reached the point where the private drive to Overcombe Grange branched off from the main road, marked by a pair of weathered stone pillars that had stood sentinel there for the better part of 2 centuries. Mrs. Bantry turned between them with careful precision, and immediately they found themselves enveloped by the oppressive presence of the yew grove. The ancient trees had grown to enormous proportions over the decades, their dark branches intertwining overhead to form a natural tunnel that blocked out what little moonlight remained. In daylight, the effect was merely atmospheric. Tonight, it was decidedly unsettling. "I've always found these trees rather gloomy," Mrs. Bantry confessed, reducing her speed still further as the drive curved sharply to the left. Mrs. Arkwright's late husband was forever threatening to have them cut down, but somehow he never quite got around to it. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, though her attention was caught by something else entirely. Through a gap in the trees ahead, she had glimpsed the house itself, and what she saw puzzled her considerably. As they emerged from the yew tunnel and approached the circular drive that swept before Overcombe Grange's imposing Georgian facade, the puzzle became even more pronounced. Every window on the upper floor blazed with light, casting warm yellow rectangles across the rain-soaked gravel and illuminating the storm-tossed gardens beyond. Mrs. Bantry brought the Morris to a halt beside Dr. Haydock's vehicle and switched off the engine. For a moment both women sat in silence, staring up at the brilliantly lit house. "How very extraordinary," Mrs. Bantry breathed. "Mrs. Arkwright is usually so particular about economy. I can't recall ever seeing more than 2 or 3 rooms lit at once." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene before them. Most unusual indeed. One might almost think the house was prepared for some special occasion. They made their way to the front door through the driving rain, Mrs. Bantry clutching her coat tightly about her, while Miss Marple moved with the careful deliberation of one accustomed to navigating treacherous conditions. The door stood slightly ajar, which struck Miss Marple as yet another curious detail in an evening already full of them. The entrance hall of Overcombe Grange had always possessed a certain austere grandeur, with its black and white checkered marble floor and its portrait-lined walls rising to a coffered ceiling. Tonight, however, the usual atmosphere of quiet dignity was disturbed by an unmistakable sense of urgency and confusion. Dr. Haydock's medical bag sat open on the hall table, its contents partially visible, while his coat had been flung carelessly across a chair. But it was the figure standing beside the grand staircase that immediately drew their attention. Godfrey Miles turned as they entered, his thin face wearing an expression of grave concern that seemed entirely appropriate to the circumstances. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the precise movements and careful speech that marked him as someone accustomed to dealing with matters of life and death on a daily basis. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," he said, inclining his head respectfully, "I fear you find us in rather distressing circumstances." "How is Mrs. Arkwright?" Mrs. Bantry inquired immediately. "We came as soon as we heard of her attack." Mr. Miles glanced toward the staircase, then back to his visitors. "Dr. Haydock is with her now, along with Nurse Pell. I brought the oxygen cylinders, of course, but—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I'm afraid the situation appears quite serious." Miss Marple observed him closely as he spoke, noting the way his hands moved restlessly at his sides and the slight tremor in his voice. Anxiety was natural under such circumstances, but there was something about his manner that suggested more than mere professional concern. "You were most thoughtful to anticipate the need for oxygen," she remarked gently. "However did you learn of Mrs. Arkwright's condition so quickly?" For just a moment Mr. Miles seemed taken aback by the question. I happened to be passing the surgery when Nurse Pell's call came through. Dr. Haydock mentioned the severity of the attack, and I thought it best to come prepared." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, yet Miss Marple found herself filing it away for future consideration, alongside her other observations of the evening. There had been something in his hesitation, a fraction of a second's delay, that suggested the answer had not come quite as naturally as it might have. "The house seems unusually well lit tonight," Mrs. Bantry observed, glancing up at the chandelier that blazed overhead. "Is that for Mrs. Arkwright's comfort?" "Nurse Pell's instructions," Mr. Miles replied promptly. "She felt that adequate lighting would be essential for Dr. Haydock's examination." From somewhere above came the sound of voices, muffled but urgent in tone. Mr. Miles glanced toward the staircase again, his expression growing more troubled. "Perhaps," he suggested, "it would be best if you waited in the morning room. I fear the next few hours may prove quite difficult." But even as he spoke, the sound of footsteps could be heard descending the main staircase, and Dr. Haydock appeared at the top of the landing, his face grave in the brilliant light that flooded down from above. "Miles," he called down, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I shall need you to come up at once, and perhaps—" His gaze fell upon Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry. "Perhaps our friends might remain below for the present." There was something in the doctor's tone that made Miss Marple's pulse quicken slightly. She had heard that particular note before, in voices speaking of matters that went beyond the merely medical into territory far more troubling. As Mr. Miles hurried up the staircase, Mrs. Bantry moved closer to Miss Marple and spoke in a low voice. "There's something not quite right about all this, isn't there, Jane?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the landing above. "Indeed, my dear Dolly, indeed there is. Chapter 3. The doctor on the carpet, the patient still and cold." The minutes stretched with agonizing slowness as Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry waited in the morning room, listening to the muffled sounds from above. The storm continued its assault upon the house, sending periodic gusts of wind down the chimney that caused the fire to flicker and dance in a most unsettling manner. Mrs. Bantry had settled herself in a wing-backed chair near the hearth, but her usual composure was clearly strained. She kept glancing toward the ceiling, as though she might divine from the footsteps overhead the nature of the drama unfolding in Mrs. Arkwright's bedroom. "It's been nearly 20 minutes, she observed, consulting the small gold watch pinned to her lapel. Surely if it were merely an asthma attack, even a severe one. "Patience, my dear," Miss Marple counselled gently, though she too felt the oppressive weight of the prolonged silence. She had positioned herself near the morning room's tall windows, ostensibly to observe the storm's progress, but in reality to maintain a clear view of both the entrance hall and the staircase beyond. It was this vantage point that allowed her to witness the sudden appearance of Nurse Pell at the top of the landing, her usually immaculate uniform dishevelled, and her face bearing an expression of unmistakable distress. The nurse descended the stairs with hurried, uneven steps, one hand pressed to her throat as though she were struggling to breathe. "Nurse Pell appears to be coming down," Miss Marple announced quietly, causing Mrs. Bantry to rise from her chair with immediate concern. The nurse burst into the morning room without ceremony, her professional composure entirely abandoned. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, with the sturdy build and sensible demeanour typical of her profession, but tonight she seemed almost fragile in her obvious distress. "Oh, Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," she gasped, sinking into the nearest chair without invitation. "Thank goodness you're here. I hardly know what to do with myself." "Whatever has happened?" Mrs. Bantry inquired, moving to pour a glass of water from the carafe on the side table. "Is Mrs. Arkwright—" Nurse Pell accepted the water with trembling hands, taking several sips before she could speak coherently. "She's gone," she whispered. "Poor Mrs. Arkwright is gone, and Dr. Haydock—" She paused, pressing her handkerchief to her eyes. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple prompted gently, though a cold certainty was already forming in her mind. "Found him unconscious on the floor beside the bed," Nurse Pell continued, her voice barely audible above the storm's howling. "Collapsed, he was, with his stethoscope twisted beneath him, something dreadful. Mr. Miles is with him now, trying to bring him round." The implications of this revelation settled over the room like a pall. Mrs. Bantry sank back into her chair, while Miss Marple remained standing, her mind already beginning to sort through the troubling possibilities that such circumstances suggested. "Tell us exactly what happened," Miss Marple said, her tone kind but firm. "From the beginning, if you please." Nurse Pell drew a shuddering breath and made a visible effort to compose herself. "Dr. Haydock arrived perhaps half an hour ago, maybe a bit more. He came straight up to Mrs. Arkwright's room, where I was waiting with her. She was having one of her attacks, certainly, but I've seen her much worse." "And then?" Miss Marple encouraged. "Well, the doctor examined her in his usual thorough manner, listened to her chest, checked her pulse, looked at her throat. Then he opened his medical bag and began preparing an injection. He drew up the medication into his hypodermic, very careful-like, the way he always does." Nurse Pell paused to take another sip of water, her hands still trembling slightly. "That's when it happened. He had just finished preparing the injection when he suddenly staggered, made a sort of gasping sound like he couldn't catch his breath. Then he just fell, right there on the carpet beside Mrs. Arkwright's bed." "And Mrs. Arkwright herself?" Mrs. Bantry asked quietly. "I went to her immediately, of course, but—" Nurse Pell's voice broke slightly. "She'd passed away while I was tending to the doctor, peaceful-like, propped up on her pillows just as I'd left her. There was a glass on the bedside table, still had a bit of her evening medicine in it." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention she habitually applied to any sequence of events that deviated from the expected pattern. "Dr. Haydock's medical bag," she said. "Was it disturbed in any way?" "Open it was, with things scattered about a bit. And—" Nurse Pell hesitated, then continued with obvious reluctance. "The hypodermic he'd been using wasn't there. Must have fallen somewhere when he collapsed, though we haven't found it yet." The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the approach of Mr. Miles, who appeared in the doorway looking considerably more composed than when he had hurried upstairs earlier. His usually neat appearance was somewhat dishevelled, and there were damp patches on his waistcoat that suggested he'd been administering some form of medical assistance. "How is Dr. Haydock?" Mrs. Bantry inquired immediately. "Conscious now, though still quite dazed," Mr. Miles reported. "I've managed to get him settled on the sofa in Mrs. Arkwright's sitting room. He seems to have suffered some form of collapse, though I cannot determine the cause." Miss Marple studied the chemist's face carefully. His professional manner had returned, but she detected an underlying tension that suggested more than ordinary concern for a colleague's welfare. "Most fortunate that you were here to assist," she observed. "Have you any theories about what might have caused Dr. Haydock's collapse?" Mr. Miles considered the question with apparent seriousness. "It's difficult to say without a proper examination. The storm, the urgency of the call, the stress of losing a patient, any combination of factors might have contributed." "Losing a patient," Mrs. Bantry repeated. "But surely Mrs. Arkwright's death was natural. Her heart, perhaps, weakened by years of respiratory distress." "One would certainly hope so," Mr. Miles replied, though something in his tone suggested he harboured doubts on the matter. It was then that the sound of another motor car could be heard approaching through the storm, its engine note different from either Dr. Haydock's vehicle or Mrs. Bantry's Morris. Through the morning room windows, Miss Marple could see headlights sweeping across the drive as the new arrival navigated the circular approach to the house. "That will be Inspector Slack," Mr. Miles announced with evident relief. "I took the liberty of telephoning for him before the lines went down completely. Under the circumstances, I felt it would be prudent to have official representation." Miss Marple nodded approvingly, though she found herself wondering exactly when Mr. Miles had found the opportunity to make such a call, and what specific circumstances had prompted him to feel that police intervention was necessary. As the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the storm, followed by hurried footsteps on the gravel drive, she reflected that the evening's mysteries were multiplying with disturbing rapidity. 2 people had entered Mrs. Arkwright's bedroom in apparent good health, yet one was now dead and the other unconscious under circumstances that defied ready explanation. The front door opened with its characteristic creak, and Inspector Slack's familiar voice could be heard in the entrance hall, sharp with the authority of official duty. Whatever secrets Overcombe Grange might harbour, Miss Marple thought, they would soon be subject to the scrutiny of the law, though whether that scrutiny would prove sufficient to uncover the truth remained, in her experienced opinion, very much to be seen. Chapter 4. Miss Marple notes a water-stained prescription. Inspector Slack's arrival brought with it the familiar atmosphere of official efficiency that Miss Marple had observed on previous occasions when the forces of law and order descended upon the normally peaceful environs of St. Mary Mead and its surroundings. The inspector himself appeared in the morning-room doorway, his raincoat dripping steadily onto the polished floor, his sharp features set in the expression of professional scepticism that she had come to know so well. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," he acknowledged with a brief nod before turning his attention to the others present. "Mr. Miles, I believe? And you must be Nurse Pell." Having established the identities of all parties, Inspector Slack wasted no time in taking charge of the situation. "I understand we have a death under somewhat unusual circumstances, with Dr. Haydock himself taken ill. I shall need to examine the scene immediately, and I'll require statements from each of you in due course." "Of course, Inspector," Mr. Miles replied, "though I should mention that Dr. Haydock is still quite unwell. Perhaps it would be advisable to have him examined by another physician." "Already arranged," Slack said briskly. "Dr. Morrison from the next village is on his way, storm permitting. Now then, I'll need the bedroom sealed until I've had a proper look at things." As the inspector issued his instructions with characteristic authority, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to a detail that others seemed to have overlooked. On a small writing desk near the morning-room's windows lay several sheets of paper that appeared to have been disturbed, perhaps by the wind from an open door or window, or possibly by more deliberate means. While Inspector Slack conferred with Mr. Miles about the practical arrangements for securing the scene, Miss Marple moved quietly toward the desk, her experienced eye taking in the scattered documents with interest. Most appeared to be household bills and correspondence of the mundane sort that accumulated in any well-run establishment, but one item in particular caught her attention. It was a single sheet torn from a prescription pad, bearing Dr. Haydock's familiar letterhead and what appeared to be his equally familiar handwriting. Yet as Miss Marple examined it more closely, she noticed several peculiarities that troubled her considerably. The paper itself showed clear evidence of water damage along one edge, creating a series of faint tide marks that suggested it had been dampened and then allowed to dry. This was curious in itself, as the room appeared entirely dry, and she could see no obvious source of moisture that might account for such staining. More puzzling still was the ink used in the prescription's composition. While Dr. Haydock invariably used black ink in his professional correspondence, this particular document had been written in blue, and not merely any blue, but a distinctly lighter shade that seemed somehow less authoritative than his usual choice. Miss Marple glanced around to ensure that the others remained occupied with their discussions, then carefully lifted the prescription sheet for closer examination. The handwriting, while superficially similar to Dr. Haydock's characteristic style, displayed several subtle variations that her trained eye found significant. The formation of certain letters, particularly the capital letters that began each line, showed a hesitancy that was quite unlike the doctor's usual confident penmanship. "Most interesting," she murmured to herself, slipping the sheet discreetly into her reticule, just as Inspector Slack concluded his conversation with Mr. Miles. "Right then," the inspector announced. "I'll begin upstairs. Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, I'll ask you to remain here for the present. Nurse Pell, I'll need you to accompany me to show me exactly how you found things." As the official party departed for the upper floors, Mrs. Bantry moved to join Miss Marple near the windows. "You look thoughtful, Jane," she observed. "Have you noticed something?" "Several things, actually," Miss Marple replied quietly, ensuring that her voice would not carry to the hall beyond. "Tell me, Dolly, in your acquaintance with Mrs. Arkwright, did you ever know her to be careless with water, spilling drinks perhaps, or leaving wet glasses about?" Mrs. Bantry considered the question with evident surprise. "Quite the contrary, actually. She was most particular about such matters. I remember her once becoming quite distressed when a housemaid left a watering on one of her antique tables." "Why do you ask?" Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of voices from the entrance hall announced the arrival of Dr. Morrison, who could be heard stamping his feet and shaking the rain from his coat. His voice carried clearly as he spoke with someone, presumably a constable who had arrived with Inspector Slack. "Dreadful night for such business," Dr. Morrison was saying, "though I suppose death keeps no appointments with the weather." The newcomer's footsteps could be heard ascending the stairs, followed by a period of relative quiet that was broken only by the storm's continued assault upon the windows and the occasional creak of the old house settling around them. Mrs. Bantry had taken up her knitting, a complex pattern that required considerable attention, but Miss Marple noticed that her friend's usual dexterity seemed somewhat impaired by the evening's events. Several stitches had gone astray, and Mrs. Bantry was obliged to unpick them with obvious frustration. "I cannot seem to concentrate properly," she confessed. "The whole business is so very unsettling. Poor Mrs. Arkwright and Dr. Haydock taken ill so suddenly. What do you suppose could have caused such a thing?" Miss Marple settled herself more comfortably in her chair, her mind turning over the various elements of the evening's drama. "There are several possibilities," she said carefully, "though I confess that some aspects of the situation strike me as rather odd." "Such as?" "Well, for instance, the matter of the bedroom lights. You remarked yourself upon how unusual it was for Mrs. Arkwright to have so many rooms illuminated at once. Yet Nurse Pell is an experienced professional who would surely know that excessive lighting is more likely to agitate an asthma sufferer than to comfort them." Mrs. Bantry paused in her knitting to consider this observation. "That's quite true. And Mr. Miles's explanation about Dr. Haydock requiring good light for his examinations doesn't quite ring true either, does it? He's attended Mrs. Arkwright many times before, always by lamplight." "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "And then there's the curious matter of timing. Mr. Miles arrived with oxygen cylinders almost as quickly as Dr. Haydock himself, despite claiming he only learned of the emergency by chance. The conversation was interrupted by the return of Inspector Slack, whose expression had grown considerably more grim during his examination of the scene upstairs. He was accompanied by Dr. Morrison, an elderly gentleman whose usual cheerful demeanour seemed notably subdued. "Ladies," Inspector Slack began without preamble, "I'm afraid the situation is rather more serious than it initially appeared. Dr. Morrison has examined both Dr. Haydock and the deceased, and his findings are troubling." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his professional gravity evident in every line of his bearing. "Dr. Haydock appears to have suffered some form of nervous shock or collapse, though the precise cause remains unclear. As for Mrs. Arkwright," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I cannot rule out the possibility that her death was not entirely natural." The implications of this statement settled over the room like a shroud. Mrs. Bantry's knitting fell forgotten into her lap, while Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of that peculiar mixture of sadness and intellectual curiosity that always accompanied her encounters with the darker aspects of human nature. "You're suggesting," Mrs. Bantry said slowly, "that Mrs. Arkwright might have been murdered?" Dr. Morrison exchanged a glance with Inspector Slack before responding. "I'm suggesting that a post-mortem examination will be necessary to determine the exact cause of death. Until then, I'm afraid this house must be treated as the scene of a potential crime." Chapter 5. Footprints Traced in Silver Nitrate. The revelation that Mrs. Arkwright's death might not have been natural cast a pall over the proceedings that even the storm's continued fury could not dispel. Inspector Slack wasted no time in establishing the protocols that such circumstances demanded, cordoning off the upper floors and positioning a constable at the foot of the main staircase with instructions that no one was to pass without his express permission. Miss Marple observed these arrangements with quiet approval, though her mind was already turning over the various puzzles that the evening had presented. The water-stained prescription sheet rested securely in her reticule, a tangible piece of evidence that she intended to examine more thoroughly when circumstances permitted. It was while she was considering the implications of this discovery that Sergeant Lake arrived, bringing with him the specialised equipment that modern police work sometimes required. Miss Marple had encountered the sergeant on previous occasions and had formed a favourable impression of his methodical approach to investigation. "Evening, Inspector," Sergeant Lake announced, shaking the rain from his coat as he entered the morning room. "I've brought the photographic apparatus and the ultraviolet lamp as requested." "Excellent," Inspector Slack replied. "We'll need comprehensive documentation of the scene, and I want particular attention paid to any trace evidence that might not be immediately visible." Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. "Ultraviolet lamp? I'm afraid I don't understand." Sergeant Lake, who possessed the teacher's instinct for clear explanation, was happy to enlighten her. "Certain substances fluoresce under ultraviolet light, madam. Things that might be completely invisible to the naked eye can appear quite clearly when illuminated properly." "How fascinating," Mrs. Bantry murmured, though Miss Marple noted that her friend's tone suggested more apprehension than genuine interest. The sergeant's equipment proved its worth almost immediately. As he began his systematic examination of the entrance hall, the portable ultraviolet lamp revealed what appeared to be a series of faint smears across the black and white checkered marble floor, leading from the base of the main staircase toward the rear of the house. "Well, well," Inspector Slack observed with evident satisfaction. "What do you make of those, Sergeant?" Sergeant Lake knelt beside the glowing traces, examining them with professional interest. "They appear to be footprints, sir. Though not made by mud or ordinary dirt, the substance has a distinctly metallic appearance under the ultraviolet light." "Silver nitrate," came a voice from the doorway, and all heads turned to see Mr. Miles standing there, his expression one of obvious distress. "I fear those traces may be silver nitrate." Inspector Slack's eyes sharpened immediately. "Indeed? And how would you know that, Mr. Miles?" The chemist stepped into the hall, his movements careful and deliberate. "It's a substance I use regularly in my professional capacity, Inspector. Dilute silver nitrate solution is excellent for testing the cleanliness of dispensing equipment. It leaves characteristic stains when it comes into contact with organic matter. Miss Marple found this explanation interesting on several levels, not least because it provided a logical reason for the presence of such an unusual substance in the house. Yet something about Mr. Miles's manner as he delivered this information struck her as carefully rehearsed, as though he had anticipated the need for such an explanation. "You use this substance regularly," Inspector Slack pressed, "and you brought some with you tonight." "I always carry a small quantity in my professional kit," Mr. Miles confirmed. "It's an essential tool for maintaining proper standards of hygiene in pharmaceutical work." Sergeant Lake continued his examination of the glowing footprints, tracing their path with methodical precision. "They lead from the staircase to the rear corridor, sir," he reported. "Appears someone walked this route after stepping in the substance." "The back stairs," Mr. Miles offered helpfully. "There's a servant's staircase that provides access to the upper floors without using the main stairway." Inspector Slack absorbed this information with the air of a man filing away potentially significant details. "I see. And did you have occasion to use those backstairs tonight, Mr. Miles?" "Certainly not," the chemist replied with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "I came up the main staircase when Dr. Haydock called for my assistance, and I've used no other route." Miss Marple watched this exchange with growing interest, noting the subtle tensions that seemed to underlie the apparently straightforward questions and answers. There was something about the entire situation that reminded her of a theatrical performance, with each participant playing a carefully rehearsed role. "Sergeant Lake," Inspector Slack continued, "I want you to follow those traces to their conclusion. Document everything you find, and pay particular attention to any areas where the concentration appears heaviest." As the sergeant set about his task, moving deeper into the house with his ultraviolet lamp, casting eerie purple shadows on the walls, Mrs. Bantry moved closer to Miss Marple. "This is all becoming rather sinister, isn't it?" she whispered. "Silver nitrate footprints, mysterious prescriptions. One almost begins to suspect deliberate mischief." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "Though I find myself wondering about the timing of these discoveries. It's remarkable how many unusual circumstances have come to light in such a short period." Their conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Lake's voice calling from the rear of the house. "Inspector, you'll want to see this." Inspector Slack hurried toward the sound, followed by the others, until they found themselves in a narrow corridor that Miss Marple recognized as the servants' area of the house. Here, the ultraviolet lamp revealed an even more concentrated area of fluorescent traces, clustered around the base of a steep wooden staircase that led to the upper floors. "The concentration is much heavier here," Sergeant Lake reported, as though someone had paused in this spot perhaps to remove contaminated shoes or clothing. Mr. Miles examined the glowing traces with what appeared to be professional interest. "The pattern is consistent with someone attempting to clean silver nitrate from their footwear," he observed, "though they were not entirely successful, as you can see." Inspector Slack turned to face the chemist directly. "Mr. Miles, I'm going to ask you again. Did you at any time tonight use these back stairs?" "I did not," Mr. Miles replied firmly. "And I must say, Inspector, that I find the implication rather offensive." "No offence intended," Slack said mildly. "But you'll understand that we must account for the presence of a substance that you yourself have admitted to carrying." Miss Marple found herself studying Mr. Miles's face as this exchange continued, noting the way his jaw tightened slightly, and how his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. His protestations of innocence seemed genuine enough, yet there was something about his overall demeanour that suggested a man labouring under considerable strain. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "Mr. Miles might examine his professional kit to determine whether any of his silver nitrate solution is missing." The chemist looked startled by this suggestion, then nodded slowly. "Of course. An excellent idea, Miss Marple. I shall check immediately." As he hurried away to retrieve his equipment, Inspector Slack turned to Sergeant Lake. "Continue following those traces upstairs. I want to know exactly where they lead and what we might find at their destination." The sergeant nodded and began his careful ascent of the narrow staircase, the ultraviolet lamp casting weird shadows on the walls as he climbed. Within moments, his voice could be heard from above, tinged with unmistakable excitement. "Inspector, the trail leads directly to Mrs. Arkwright's corridor, and there's something else up here you'll want to see." As they prepared to join the sergeant on the upper floor, Miss Marple reflected that the evening's mysteries were deepening with each new discovery. The silver nitrate traces suggested a deliberate attempt at concealment, while their location implied knowledge of the house's layout that went beyond casual familiarity. Whatever had truly transpired in Mrs. Arkwright's bedroom, she was becoming increasingly certain that it involved considerably more planning and premeditation than a simple medical emergency gone awry. Chapter 6. 2 stethoscopes, but one too new. The upper floor of Overcombe Grange revealed its secrets reluctantly under Sergeant Lake's methodical examination. The silver nitrate traces led them through the main corridor, past several closed doors to the very threshold of Mrs. Arkwright's bedroom, where they seemed to concentrate with particular intensity around the doorframe itself. Inspector Slack paused at the entrance to the room, his experienced eye taking in the scene that awaited within. Mrs. Arkwright's bedroom had been preserved exactly as it was found, with the late woman still propped against her pillows in the large four-poster bed, her face bearing the peaceful expression that often accompanies a gentle passing. Dr. Haydock had been moved to the adjacent sitting room, where he lay upon a sofa under Dr. Morrison's watchful care, still pale and somewhat confused but mercifully conscious. His medical bag remained where it had been discovered, open upon a small table near the bed, its contents scattered in a manner that spoke of urgent activity suddenly interrupted. "Now then," Inspector Slack announced, producing his notebook, "let's catalogue exactly what we have here." Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the proceedings without interfering, noting with interest how the inspector's systematic approach began to impose order upon what had initially appeared to be chaos. Each item was examined, documented, and carefully set aside, building a comprehensive picture of the evening's tragic events. It was during this methodical inventory that the first truly puzzling discovery came to light. "Here's Dr. Haydock's stethoscope," Sergeant Lake announced, lifting the familiar instrument from where it had lain twisted beneath the doctor's unconscious form. The stethoscope was well worn, its metal components bearing the patina of long and faithful service, the rubber tubing slightly discoloured with age. Inspector Slack made a note, then continued his examination of the medical bag's contents. "And here's—" He paused, frowning. "That's odd." "What is it, Inspector?" Mrs. Bantry inquired from her position near the doorway. "Another stethoscope," Slack replied, holding up a second instrument that gleamed with the unmistakable brilliance of new manufacture. Brand new by the look of it, still has the maker's tags attached. Mr. Miles, who had returned from examining his professional kit with the announcement that his silver nitrate supply appeared untouched, stepped forward to examine the duplicate instrument. "How very curious," he murmured. "I can't imagine why Dr. Haydock would carry 2 stethoscopes." "Perhaps you can enlighten us, Mr. Miles," Inspector Slack suggested, his tone carrying a subtle edge. "After all, you seem remarkably well informed about medical procedures for a dispensing chemist." Mr. Miles appeared genuinely puzzled by the discovery. "I'm afraid I can offer no explanation, Inspector, though... He hesitated, then continued more slowly. "I do recall Mrs. Arkwright mentioning some weeks ago that she intended to purchase medical equipment for Nurse Pell's use. She was most considerate of her staff's professional needs." This explanation drew an immediate response from Nurse Pell, who had been standing quietly near the window. "That's quite untrue," she said firmly. "Mrs. Arkwright never mentioned any such purchase to me, and I certainly never requested a stethoscope. I've always preferred to use Mrs. Arkwright's own ear trumpet for monitoring her heart tones. It's an antique piece, but perfectly adequate for my needs." The contradiction hung in the air like an accusation, and Miss Marple observed how Mr. Miles's face coloured slightly under the nurse's forthright denial. There was clearly more to this matter than appeared on the surface. Where exactly was this second stethoscope found? Miss Marple inquired gently. Sergeant Lake consulted his notes. In Mr. Miles's professional kit, miss, tucked beneath the tray that holds his smaller instruments. My kit? Mr. Miles sounded genuinely astonished. But that's impossible. I would certainly know if I were carrying a stethoscope. Inspector Slack's expression had grown decidedly sceptical. Would you indeed, Mr. Miles? Yet here it is, found among your belongings, and you claim Mrs. Arkwright ordered it for Nurse Pell, while the nurse herself denies any knowledge of such an arrangement. There must be some mistake, Mr. Miles insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Perhaps someone placed it there without my knowledge. Someone? Slack pressed. And when might this mysterious someone have had access to your professional kit? Miss Marple watched this exchange with growing interest, noting how the chemist's initial composure was beginning to fray under the inspector's persistent questioning. There was something about his manner that suggested a man struggling to maintain a facade that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Inspector, she said quietly, might I suggest that we examine the stethoscope more closely? Sometimes the most revealing details are found in the smallest particulars. Slack nodded and handed her the gleaming instrument. Miss Marple examined it with the meticulous attention she habitually applied to any object that seemed out of place in its surroundings. Most interesting, she murmured after a moment. The manufacturer's label indicates this was purchased quite recently, within the past fortnight, I would estimate, based on the date code. And here... She paused, adjusting her spectacles. There's a small inscription on the chest piece. What does it say? Mrs. Bantry asked, moving closer to peer at the instrument. For Nurse Pell, with gratitude, Miss Marple read aloud. From L.A. One assumes that would be Lydia Arkwright. This revelation caused Nurse Pell to shake her head emphatically. Mrs. Arkwright never gave me any such gift, and she certainly never expressed any intention to do so. We maintained a cordial professional relationship, nothing more. Mr. Miles had grown noticeably pale during this exchange, and Miss Marple observed how his hands trembled slightly as he reached into his waistcoat pocket for his handkerchief. I'm sure there must be some explanation, he stammered. Perhaps Mrs. Arkwright intended it as a surprise. A surprise that never materialized, Inspector Slack observed dryly. How very convenient for your theory, Mr. Miles. The tension in the room was becoming palpable, and Miss Marple sensed that they were approaching a critical juncture in the evening's revelations. The presence of the duplicate stethoscope, combined with Mr. Miles's increasingly unconvincing explanations, suggested a level of premeditation that cast the entire sequence of events in a far more sinister light. Inspector, she said carefully, I wonder whether it might be profitable to examine Mr. Miles's silver nitrate supply more thoroughly. Earlier tests have a way of revealing what closer inspection might uncover. An excellent suggestion, Slack agreed. Mr. Miles, I'll ask you to produce your professional kit for complete examination. As the chemist reluctantly complied with this request, Miss Marple reflected that the truth was beginning to emerge from the tangle of confusion and misdirection that had initially obscured it. The evening's mysteries were far from solved, but the pattern of deception was becoming increasingly clear. Whatever Mr. Miles's true role in the night's tragic events, she was becoming convinced that his presence at Overcombe Grange had been considerably less accidental than he had claimed. Chapter 7. Midnight in the surgery dispensing room. The clock in the entrance hall of Overcombe Grange had just chimed midnight when Inspector Slack announced his intention to conduct a thorough search of Dr. Haydock's surgery. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the wind continued to rattle the windows with such persistence that conversation required deliberate effort to be heard above its howling. I want to examine every aspect of this case systematically, the inspector declared, consulting his pocket watch. If there's been foul play, as Dr. Morrison's preliminary examination suggests, then we must consider the possibility that evidence exists beyond this house. Miss Marple found this proposal entirely sensible, though she noted with interest that Mr. Miles appeared considerably less enthusiastic about the prospect of such an extended investigation. The chemist had grown increasingly agitated as the evening progressed, and his earlier composure had given way to a nervous restlessness that manifested itself in frequent adjustments to his collar and repeated consultations of his own timepiece. Surely such an examination could wait until morning, he suggested. The surgery will be locked, and Dr. Haydock is hardly in condition to provide access. Dr. Haydock gave me his keys before he was moved to the sitting room, Inspector Slack replied matter-of-factly, and I prefer to conduct my investigations while events are fresh in everyone's memory. Mrs. Bantry looked uncertainly between the inspector and Miss Marple. Jane, dear, perhaps we should return home. This business is becoming rather more involved than either of us anticipated. Miss Marple considered the suggestion with the careful deliberation she applied to all such decisions, while the lateness of the hour and the continuing severity of the weather provided compelling arguments for departure. Her instinct suggested that the most crucial revelations of the evening might yet lie ahead. "I think, Dolly, that we might accompany Inspector Slack to the surgery," she said gently. "These circumstances are most unusual, and I confess to a certain curiosity about what might be discovered there." Sergeant Lake had completed his documentation of the bedroom scene and was preparing to accompany the inspector, while Dr. Morrison remained with his patient. Nurse Pell elected to stay at Overcombe Grange, claiming a professional duty to remain near Mrs. Arkwright's body until the proper authorities could make arrangements for its removal. This left Mr. Miles in the awkward position of either volunteering to accompany the party to the surgery or remaining at the house, under circumstances that would make his reluctance to participate in the investigation painfully obvious. "Of course I shall come," he announced with an attempt at his earlier professional manner, "though I must say I find it rather irregular to conduct such searches in the middle of the night." The journey back to the village through the storm proved every bit as treacherous as Miss Marple had anticipated. The fallen telephone lines had been joined by several substantial tree branches, and at one point they were obliged to make a considerable detour to avoid a completely blocked section of road. Dr. Haydock's surgery presented a stark contrast to the dramatic scene they had left behind at Overcombe Grange. Here, everything appeared normal and orderly, with the doctor's personal effects arranged with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to professional matters. Inspector Slack wasted no time in beginning his systematic examination, starting with the consulting room where the fateful telephone call had been received. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the proceedings while remaining unobtrusive, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the familiar surroundings. It was Sergeant Lake who made the first significant discovery, calling attention to the surgery's locked dispensing room, with its impressive steel safe that contained the more dangerous pharmaceutical supplies. "The lock shows signs of recent tampering," he reported, examining the mechanism with a magnifying glass. "Fresh scratches around the keyhole, as though someone had difficulty with the correct key." Mr. Miles stepped forward immediately. "That's quite impossible, Sergeant. I'm the only person other than Dr. Haydock who has access to that safe, and I can assure you that I've made no unauthorized entries." "Indeed?" Inspector Slack's tone carried a note of skepticism that had become increasingly pronounced throughout the evening. "And yet here we have clear evidence of recent interference with the lock mechanism." Miss Marple watched as the inspector produced Dr. Haydock's keys and opened the safe with practised efficiency. The interior revealed the usual array of controlled substances, each bottle and vial carefully labelled and arranged according to some system that presumably made sense to medical professionals. "Everything appears to be in order," Slack observed initially, then paused as his examination reached the lower shelves. "Wait, what's this?" He withdrew 2 identical glass vials, each bearing a printed label that read, "Aminophylline for emergency use." The similarity between them was immediately obvious, yet as he held them up to the light, a crucial difference became apparent. "Same labels, same apparent contents," he noted, "but look at this." He held the second vial closer to the lamp on Dr. Haydock's desk. "The liquid in this one has a distinctly different colour, and there's an unmistakable odour of bitter almonds." Mr. Miles had gone very pale indeed, and Miss Marple observed how his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. I cannot account for. Surely there must be some mistake." "No mistake about that smell," Sergeant Lake contributed grimly. "That's cyanide, or something very like it, disguised to look like legitimate medication." The implications of this discovery settled over the room like a pall. Here was clear evidence of deliberate substitution, a deadly preparation designed to appear identical to a life-saving drug. The premeditation required for such an act spoke to a level of malice that transformed the evening's events from tragedy to calculated murder. Inspector Slack carefully sealed both files as evidence before turning his attention to other areas of the dispensing room. It was behind the main counter that he made his next significant discovery. "Edward Arkwright," he announced, pulling a crouching figure from its hiding place among the storage cabinets. "And what, might I ask, are you doing concealed in Dr. Haydock's surgery at this hour of the night?" Edward Arkwright was a man of perhaps 35 years, with the soft features and expensive clothing that spoke of a life lived largely at others' expense. His usually immaculate appearance was considerably dishevelled, and his face bore the expression of someone caught in circumstances he could not satisfactorily explain. I was looking for something," he stammered, attempting to brush dust from his coat. "Something that belonged to my aunt." "Indeed?" Slack's voice carried unmistakable disbelief. "And this something required you to break into a medical surgery in the middle of the night?" As if in answer to the inspector's question, Sergeant Lake discovered what Edward had been attempting to conceal in his coat pocket. Another file of aminophylline, identical to those found in the safe. 3 files now, Miss Marple observed quietly. 2 in the safe, 1 in Mr. Arkwright's possession. A most interesting collection. Edward's face had gone ashen as the implications of his situation became clear. Whatever explanations he might offer for his presence in the surgery, the discovery of the medication in his possession would prove extremely difficult to justify. "I can explain everything," he began desperately, but Inspector Slack was already reaching for his handcuffs. "Edward Arkwright," the inspector announced formally, "I am arresting you on suspicion of unlawful entry and theft of controlled substances. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Miss Marple reflected that the night's revelations were far from complete. The presence of 3 identical files, each with different contents, suggested a complexity of planning that went beyond simple theft or even straightforward murder. Chapter 8. A ledger entry, written over erasures. Edward Arkwright's arrest had created a temporary lull in the proceedings, during which Inspector Slack arranged for the prisoner to be transported to the village police station, despite the continuing severity of the storm. The young man's protestations of innocence had grown increasingly frantic as the handcuffs were applied, but his explanations remained frustratingly vague and contradictory. Miss Marple had observed this scene with the detached interest of someone well versed in the varieties of human deception. Edward's distress appeared genuine enough, yet there was something about his manner that suggested a man caught in circumstances considerably more complex than simple burglary. "Inspector," she said quietly as Sergeant Lake prepared to escort the prisoner from the surgery, "might I suggest that we examine the dispensing records before concluding our business here? In my experience, the most revealing evidence is often found in the mundane details of routine transactions." Inspector Slack paused in his supervision of Edward's removal to consider this suggestion. "The narcotics ledger, you mean?" "Yes, that would be prudent. All controlled substances must be meticulously recorded." Mr. Miles, who had remained silent during Edward's arrest, suddenly appeared eager to be helpful. "The ledger is kept in the safe," he offered quickly. "Dr. Haydock is most particular about maintaining accurate records." Miss Marple noted this sudden burst of cooperation with interest, particularly given the chemist's earlier reluctance to participate in the investigation. She positioned herself where she could observe both the ledger examination and Mr. Miles's reactions to whatever discoveries might emerge. The narcotics ledger proved to be a substantial volume bound in dark leather, its pages filled with Dr. Haydock's characteristically precise handwriting. Each entry documented the receipt, dispensing, and current inventory of various controlled substances, creating a comprehensive record of the surgery's pharmaceutical activities. Inspector Slack began his examination methodically, working backward from the most recent entries. It was Miss Marple, however, who drew attention to the crucial discovery. "Inspector," she said gently, "might I direct your attention to yesterday's entry regarding aminophylline? There appears to be something rather curious about the notation." Slack examined the indicated line with growing interest. The entry read 10 ampules aminophylline to overcome, written in what appeared to be Dr. Haydock's familiar hand, yet closer inspection revealed subtle inconsistencies that became more apparent under careful scrutiny. "The ink colour is different," Miss Marple observed, producing a small magnifying glass from her reticule. "Dr. Haydock's usual entries are made in black ink, but this particular notation appears to be in blue. More significantly, the numeral 10 showed clear evidence of alteration. When held at the proper angle to the light, erased digits could be discerned beneath the current figures, suggesting that the original entry had been systematically modified. Someone has changed this entry," Inspector Slack concluded grimly. "The question is who and why?" Mr. Miles had grown noticeably pale during this examination, and Miss Marple observed how his breathing had become somewhat laboured. When she compared the blue ink of the ledger entry to the water-stained prescription sheet in her reticule, the similarity was unmistakable. "Mr. Miles," she said with characteristic gentleness, "I wonder whether you might examine this entry more closely. Your professional expertise might help us understand the significance of these alterations." The chemist approached the ledger with obvious reluctance, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned over the open volume. After a moment's examination, he straightened with an expression of profound distress. I cannot account for these irregularities," he stammered. "Dr. Haydock's record-keeping has always been exemplary." "Indeed it has," Miss Marple agreed, "which makes these alterations all the more significant. Tell me, Mr. Miles, do you recognise the handwriting in this particular entry?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Miss Marple watched as conflicting emotions played across the chemist's face. Fear, guilt, and desperation seemed to war with some deeper loyalty or obligation that prevented him from speaking freely. I'm not certain," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Inspector Slack had been examining other recent entries while this exchange took place, and his expression had grown increasingly grim. "There are several other irregularities here," he announced. "Erasures, overwritings, and alterations that suggest systematic tampering with the records. All in the same blue ink," Miss Marple added significantly, "and all related to shipments of medication to Overcombe Grange." The pattern that was emerging painted a disturbing picture of deliberate deception spanning several weeks, or possibly months. Someone with access to the surgery's records had been systematically altering the documentation of controlled substances, presumably to conceal unauthorized transactions or substitutions. "Mr. Miles," Inspector Slack said formally, "I'm going to ask you once more, do you have any knowledge of these alterations to the narcotics ledger?" The chemist's composure finally cracked under the sustained pressure of questioning. His shoulders sagged, and he seemed to age several years in the space of a few moments. Yes, he whispered. "Yes, I altered those entries. But you must understand I had no choice in the matter." This admission created a moment of profound silence, broken only by the continued howling of the wind outside. Miss Marple felt the familiar mixture of sadness and satisfaction that always accompanied the moment when truth began to emerge from a tangle of deception and misdirection. "No choice," Inspector Slack pressed. "I'm afraid you'll need to be rather more specific, Mr. Miles." The chemist glanced around the room as though seeking some avenue of escape, then seemed to resign himself to the inevitable. "Edward Arkwright," he said heavily. He had discovered certain irregularities in my personal financial affairs. Gambling debts, you understand. Debts to rather unsavoury individuals who were becoming increasingly impatient for payment. And so he blackmailed you, Miss Marple concluded gently. Not blackmail exactly, Mr. Miles protested weakly. He called it a business arrangement. I would provide him with certain substances from the surgery stock, properly labelled to avoid suspicion, and he would help me resolve my financial difficulties. Inspector Slack's expression had grown thunderous. You supplied controlled substances to Edward Arkwright. For what purpose? He claimed they were for his aunt's treatment, Mr. Miles said desperately. Said he wanted to ensure she had adequate supplies for emergencies. I never imagined, that is, I never suspected he might intend harm. The full scope of the conspiracy was beginning to emerge, revealing a web of deception far more complex than anyone had initially suspected. Edward's financial hold over the chemist had enabled him to obtain legitimate medications that could then be altered or replaced for sinister purposes. The aminophylline, Miss Marple said quietly. You provided Edward with genuine aminophylline, which he then replaced with poisonous substitutes. Mr. Miles nodded miserably. He returned the original containers, claiming his aunt's condition had improved and the medication was no longer needed. I had no reason to suspect the contents had been tampered with. As the implications of this revelation settled over the room, Miss Marple reflected that they were finally approaching the heart of the evening's tragic events. The systematic deception documented in the ledger provided the foundation for a murder plot of considerable sophistication, one that had exploited the trust and desperation of an honest man to achieve its deadly purpose. Chapter 9. Quicksilver on the Doorknob. The return journey to Overcombe Grange was accomplished in relative silence, each member of the party absorbed in contemplating the implications of Mr. Miles's startling confession. The storm had begun to show signs of abating, though the wind still gusted with sufficient force to make conversation difficult within the confines of the motor car. Miss Marple found herself reviewing the evening's revelations with the methodical precision she habitually applied to complex puzzles. The discovery of the altered ledger entries had provided crucial insight into the conspiracy between Edward Arkwright and Godfrey Miles, yet several aspects of the case remained troublingly unclear. Upon their arrival at the house, they found Dr. Morrison waiting with news that proved both encouraging and perplexing. Dr. Haydock had regained sufficient consciousness to provide a coherent account of his experiences, though his recollections remained somewhat fragmentary. He remembers arriving at the house and examining Mrs. Arkwright, Dr. Morrison reported. Says she appeared to be suffering from a moderately severe asthma attack, but nothing that seemed immediately life-threatening. He prepared an injection of aminophylline, drew it up into his hypodermic in the usual manner. And then, Inspector Slack prompted. That's where his memory becomes unclear. He recalls approaching Mrs. Arkwright's bedside, then experiencing a sudden sensation of intense weakness. He mentioned something rather curious, said he detected a strong odour of bitter almonds just before he collapsed. Miss Marple exchanged a significant glance with Inspector Slack. The reference to bitter almonds provided further confirmation that cyanide had indeed been involved in the evening's events, though the exact mechanism of its administration remained unclear. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I wonder whether we might examine Mrs. Arkwright's bedroom once more. There are certain details that I should like to clarify." The bedroom appeared exactly as they had left it, with Mrs. Arkwright's peaceful form still resting among the pillows, and the scattered contents of Dr. Haydock's medical bag, arranged precisely as Sergeant Lake had documented them. Yet Miss Marple's trained eye was drawn to elements of the scene that had previously escaped attention. "The doorknob," she announced suddenly, moving toward the bedroom entrance. "Inspector, might I trouble you to examine this more closely?" Inspector Slack joined her at the threshold, his expression puzzled. "It appears perfectly ordinary to me, Miss Marple. Brass fittings, typical of a house of this period." "Perhaps," she agreed, "but observe the surface more carefully. Do you notice anything unusual about the metal's appearance?" Closer examination revealed what appeared to be minute droplets of silvery liquid clinging to the brass surface, almost invisible unless viewed from precisely the correct angle. The substance had a distinctive metallic luster that seemed inconsistent with ordinary tarnish or moisture. "Mercury," Sergeant Lake observed, producing a small magnifying glass for more detailed inspection. And there's something else mixed with it, some sort of dark powder. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. I believe we may have discovered the mechanism by which Dr. Haydock was rendered unconscious. Someone has treated this doorknob with a mixture of mercury and what appears to be graphite powder. But what would be the purpose of such a preparation? Inspector Slack inquired. Conductivity, came a weak voice from the doorway, and all heads turned to see Dr. Haydock himself, supported by Dr. Morrison, but evidently determined to participate in the investigation. Mercury and graphite would create an excellent electrical conductor. Despite Dr. Morrison's protests about the advisability of such exertion, Dr. Haydock insisted on examining the doorknob himself. His professional curiosity had clearly overcome his physical weakness, and his observations proved illuminating. If this doorknob were connected to an electrical source, he mused, anyone touching it with damp hands would receive a significant shock, not enough to cause serious injury, but certainly sufficient to cause a person to collapse, particularly if they were already under stress. Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction of seeing a complex puzzle resolve itself into logical components. Dr. Haydock, when you prepared to administer the injection, did you have occasion to touch this doorknob? Why, yes, the doctor replied, his memory evidently clearing as he focused on the sequence of events. I had drawn up the medication and was approaching Mrs. Arkwright's bedside when I realized I had left my spare hypodermic in the corridor. I stepped back to retrieve it, grasped the doorknob to steady myself as I leaned out, and that's when... He paused, his face growing pale at the recollection. When you received the electrical shock that rendered you unconscious, Miss Marple concluded gently. Someone had prepared a most ingenious trap, designed to incapacitate you at the crucial moment. Inspector Slack was already examining the room's electrical fittings with renewed interest. Near the door, partially concealed behind a heavy curtain, he discovered evidence of recent tampering with the wall socket. A length of thin wire had been carefully concealed beneath the carpet, connecting the electrical supply to the treated doorknob. Diabolically clever, he observed grimly. The perpetrator could activate the trap at will, then remove the evidence once the desired effect had been achieved. But who could have prepared such an elaborate mechanism? Dr. Morrison inquired. It would require considerable technical knowledge. Miss Marple glanced meaningfully at the waste bin beside Mrs. Arkwright's dressing table, where the fragments of a broken mercury thermometer lay scattered among other debris. Someone with access to mercury and the knowledge to use it effectively, someone who might legitimately carry such an instrument as part of their professional equipment. The implications of this discovery cast the evening's events in an entirely new light. The conspiracy between Edward Arkwright and Godfrey Miles had clearly involved considerably more planning and technical sophistication than anyone had initially suspected. Mr. Miles measured Mrs. Arkwright's temperature earlier this evening, Nurse Pell observed quietly. He used one of the old mercury thermometers from the medicine cabinet, said the new electronic ones weren't reliable enough for accurate readings. Inspector Slack's expression had grown thunderous as the full scope of the deception became clear. So Miles prepared the electrical trap using mercury from the broken thermometer, rendered Dr. Haydock unconscious at the crucial moment, then proceeded with whatever plan he and Edward had devised. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect we shall find that the actual administration of the poison was Edward's responsibility, while Mr. Miles's role was to ensure that Dr. Haydock would be unable to intervene or provide accurate testimony about what had occurred. As the various elements of the conspiracy fell into place, Miss Marple reflected that they were finally approaching a complete understanding of the evening's tragic events. The combination of blackmail, substituted medications, and ingenious technical devices revealed a murder plot of considerable complexity, one that had exploited the trust and vulnerability of all involved to achieve its deadly purpose. Yet even as the mechanism of the crime became clear, she sensed that the most crucial revelations still lay ahead in the final confrontation with those responsible for Mrs. Arkwright's death. Chapter 10. First Light and the True Dose Revealed. The grey light of dawn was beginning to filter through the tall windows of Overcombe Granger's morning room, as Miss Marple surveyed the assembled company with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally imposed order upon chaos. The storm had exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and surprisingly peaceful after the previous evening's dramatic revelations. Inspector Slack had insisted that all parties remain at the house until the investigation could be properly concluded, and the morning room now contained what Miss Marple privately considered to be all the principal actors in the night's tragic drama. Edward Arkwright sat under police guard, his earlier bravado replaced by the sullen resignation of a man who recognised that his circumstances had grown desperate indeed. Godfrey Miles occupied a chair near the window, his professional composure entirely abandoned in favour of the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had confessed to crimes that would undoubtedly destroy both his career and his reputation. Nurse Pell remained near the door, her capable hands folded in her lap, as she waited with the patient dignity of someone whose conscience was clear. Dr. Haydock, though still pale from his ordeal, had insisted on attending this final gathering, supported by Dr. Morrison's professional concern and his own determination to understand exactly what had befallen his patient. Mrs. Bantry sat beside Miss Marple, her knitting abandoned in favour of close attention to the proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began in her gentle but authoritative manner, "I believe we now have sufficient information to reconstruct the events that led to Mrs. Arkwright's death and Dr. Haydock's collapse. The truth, as is often the case, proves to be both simpler and more complex than it initially appeared." She paused to arrange her thoughts, her keen eyes taking in each face in turn before continuing. "The foundation of this tragedy lies in Edward Arkwright's desperate need for money, combined with his discovery of Mr. Miles's gambling debts. These circumstances created an opportunity for blackmail that Edward was quick to exploit." Edward shifted uncomfortably in his chair but remained silent, recognising perhaps that any protest would be futile given the evidence that had been assembled against him. "Edward's plan was initially quite modest," Miss Marple continued. "He intended merely to sedate his aunt long enough to photograph a forged codicil to her will, one that would leave her considerable fortune to him rather than to the various charities she had designated as her beneficiaries." Inspector Slack nodded approvingly. "We found the forged document among his personal effects, along with the photographic equipment he intended to use. However," Miss Marple went on, "the plan grew more elaborate as Edward realised the possibilities that Mr. Miles's cooperation presented. By obtaining legitimate medications from Dr. Haydock's surgery, he could replace their contents with substances that would serve his purposes while maintaining the appearance of proper medical treatment." She turned to address Mr. Miles directly, her expression combining understanding with unmistakable disappointment. "Mr. Miles, you supplied Edward with genuine aminophylline in properly labelled containers, believing that he intended to ensure his aunt had adequate medication for emergencies. You altered the surgery's records to conceal these unauthorised transactions, using blue ink that unfortunately matched the ink you employed in your professional duties as a dispensing chemist." Miles nodded miserably. "I thought I was helping to provide better care for Mrs. Arkwright. Edward said Dr. Haydock was too conservative in his prescribing, that his aunt needed stronger medications to manage her condition effectively. In reality," Miss Marple continued, "Edward was replacing the aminophylline with a barbiturate solution, designed to render Mrs. Arkwright unconscious. His plan required precise timing, however, which is where the evening's more elaborate deceptions became necessary." She moved to stand beside the morning room's tall windows, where the strengthening daylight provided a fitting backdrop for the revelation of truth that had been so long obscured by darkness and deception. Edward's telephone call to Nurse Pell was genuine. He had indeed induced one of his aunt's asthma attacks by introducing irritants into her bedroom. However, he had also prepared the electrical trap on the doorknob, using mercury from the broken thermometer and graphite to create a conductor that would render Dr. Haydock unconscious at the crucial moment. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with evident interest. "So the bitter almond odour I detected was from the poisoned medication. that Edward intended me to administer. Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed. However, your collapse prevented you from giving the injection, which created an unexpected complication for Edward's plan. He was forced to administer the fatal dose himself, using the duplicate stethoscope as a cover for his presence in the room. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. The water stains on the prescription sheet came from Mr. Miles's silver nitrate solution, transferred when he handled the forged prescription during his preparation of the electrical trap. And the silver nitrate footprints led from Mrs. Arkwright's room to the back stairs, Miss Marple added, showing how Mr. Miles attempted to leave the scene undetected after completing his part in the deception. Nurse Pell spoke for the first time since the gathering had begun. But I don't understand why they needed such an elaborate plan. Surely if Edward simply wanted his aunt's money, there were less dangerous ways to obtain it. Miss Marple smiled sadly. I fear, Nurse Pell, that Edward's debts were considerably more pressing than he initially admitted. The people to whom he owed money were not the sort to accept delays or partial payments. He needed immediate access to his aunt's fortune, and forgery seemed the most expeditious method. Unfortunately for Edward, Inspector Slack observed grimly, his aunt discovered the forged codicil before he could complete his photography. She threatened to expose him, which transformed what had been intended as temporary sedation into permanent silencing. The full horror of the crime was now apparent to all present. What had begun as a relatively minor deception had escalated through desperation and circumstance into premeditated murder, involving not only the victim but also the unwitting participation of several innocent parties. Edward finally spoke, his voice barely audible above the gentle sounds of the awakening countryside beyond the windows. I never intended for anyone to die. It was supposed to be simple, just a few photographs, and then everything would return to normal. But murder is never simple, Mr. Arkwright, Miss Marple replied with characteristic gentleness, and the consequences of our actions often extend far beyond our original intentions. Inspector Slack rose from his chair, the official weight of his authority settling over the room like a mantle. Edward Arkwright, Godfrey Miles, I am arresting you both for the murder of Mrs. Lydia Arkwright. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence. As the handcuffs were applied and the prisoners prepared for transport to the village police station, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic waste that such crimes represented. 2 lives destroyed, a third ended, and several others permanently scarred by the events of a single November night. Dr. Haydock, though still pale from his ordeal, managed a wan smile as he prepared to resume his interrupted rounds. Well, Miss Marple, you've certainly proven that even the most careful medical practice can be disrupted by human malice. Indeed, Doctor, she replied, adjusting her hat as Mrs. Bantry prepared their departure, though I would suggest that careful observation and proper attention to detail remain the best remedies for both medical and criminal mysteries. As they walked toward Mrs. Bantry's Morris in the strengthening daylight, Dolly sighed deeply. Even a simple house call can turn deadly, can't it, Jane? Miss Marple paused to observe the peaceful countryside that surrounded Overcombe Grange, where the morning sun was already beginning to dry the previous night's rain from the ancient yew trees. Yes, my dear Dolly, she replied thoughtfully, but a close stitch of observation can mend the worst tangle of deceit.